million suffer from fibromyalgia, a condition characterized by months of widespread pain, as well as fatigue, sleep disorders, depression, anxiety, cloudy thinking, headaches, low back pain, and other illnesses. It has an enormous impact on the quality of life of patients, who may experience a reduced capacity to carry on the activities of daily living. Everyday activity becomes more difficult, more time-consuming, or simply impossible. Its cause is unknown, and there's no effective treatment for this illness. What can we do for those who suffer? Well, according to the latest review on fibromyalgia and nutrition, a vegetarian diet could have some beneficial effects, but based on what kind of evidence? Well, back in 1991, a survey was sent to a few hundred folks suffering from various chronic pain conditions, including fibromyalgia, asking if they found any success trying different diets. Some folks tried a vegetarian diet, some folks tried a vegan diet. Some reported the various diets helped with pain, stiffness, and swelling. Vegan diets were reported to reduce disease symptoms more effectively than the vegetarian diet with rheumatoid arthritis. But what we needed was to put these diets to the test in formal studies. First one was in '93. 10 fibromyalgia patients were put on a vegetarian diet for 3 weeks. The measured levels of oxidation and inflammation and cholesterol went down, no surprise, but of interest from a clinical point of view is the positive effect of the treatment upon pain status of most of the patients. 7 out of 10 felt better. They weren't sure if it was the improved condition of the fibromyalgia patients in the course of treatment with a vegetarian diet, whether it was due to the improvement of their antioxidant status, or what it was about a meat-free diet that seemed to help so much. A vegan diet was first put to the test in 2000 in Helsinki. You can tell English is not the researchers' first language, with sentences like, "Plants face heavy load of light." The point they're making is good, though. UV light generates free radicals in their tissues. All this means is that plants must be well prepared to meet the challenges of the oxidant radical stress and contain a broad variety of antioxidants. That's why plants don't get sunburned and their DNA damaged hanging out all day in the sun without any sunblock on. So what would happen if you had people live exclusively on plant items? In other words, what might be the effects of a strict vegan diet on the symptoms of fibromyalgia? In fact, this study used a raw vegan diet. The rheumatoid patients said they felt better when they started to eat the living food diet, and the symptoms got worse when they returned back to their previous omnivorous diet. But what about the fibromyalgia patients? Both groups reported having quite a lot of pain at rest in the beginning of the study, but there was a significant decrease in the raw vegan group, which gradually disappeared after shifting back to the omnivorous diet. They also found other significant changes, such as improvement in the quality of sleep, a reduction of morning stiffness, and improvement in measures of general health. So, for example, here's morning stiffness. The light bar represents those about to go on the raw vegan diet, and the dark bar is the omnivorous control group. They started out about the same, but after about a month and a half, those eating vegan felt significantly less stiff, which continued through the end of the 3-month study. And when they went back to eating their regular diet, the stiffness returned. What about pains at rest? Same thing. So, significant improvements in fibromyalgia stiffness, pain, and general health on a plant-based diet. The study only lasted 3 months, but it can be concluded that eating vegan has beneficial effects on fibromyalgia symptoms, at least in the short run. Raw vegan diets seem to really help reduce fibromyalgia symptoms. But what about just a mostly raw diet? That was tried next. Fibromyalgia engulfs patients in a downward, reinforcing cycle of unrestorative sleep, chronic pain, fatigue, inactivity, and depression. So they tested whether a mostly raw, and actually vegan diet, would significantly improve fibromyalgia symptoms, and boy, did it. FIQ is the standard survey designed specifically to measure the impact of fibromyalgia on a person's life. At the beginning of the study, they were doing pretty bad. By 2 months, though, they were doing significantly better, and by the end of the study, at 7 months, there were significant improvements in each one of these measures, so less physical impairment. They were feeling better, less absenteeism, less pain, fatigue, stiffness, anxiety, depression. In summary, a diet intervention using a mostly raw, pure vegetarian diet produced dramatic improvements in fibromyalgia syndrome symptoms. When this study was reviewed by Current Rheumatology Reports, the editor noted that it had the most impressive results of any recent fibromyalgia treatment study. For example, nearly 3 times the improvement that the Mayo Clinic reported for their fibromyalgia program. Yes, it was not a double-blind, placebo-controlled study, but as they note, it's difficult to design such a study when it comes to diet, since people tend to notice when they've switched to a vegan diet. So, raw vegan diets worked. Mostly raw vegan diets worked. Even just eating vegetarian seemed to help. What about just eating mostly vegetarian? That was the one tried most recently. Fibromyalgia symptoms put on a mostly vegetarian diet for 2 weeks, and did not see any significant improvement. Maybe if they gave it more time, we don't know. Bottom line is that the best available science to date suggests eating plant-based diets, whether vegetarian or vegan, may help people with fibromyalgia. Just because the best science we have doesn't mean it's necessarily very good science, right? These were all very small, poorly controlled, relatively short-term studies. But what's the downside of giving it a try? It turns out that people with chronic widespread pain syndromes tend to eat pretty crappy diets, perhaps explaining their higher rates of other chronic diseases such as cancer and cardiovascular disease. So even if a healthy diet doesn't help their fibromyalgia symptoms, at least it may prevent them from falling ill with something else, the last thing someone who feels miserable all day needs is another disease. In the 1990s, 2 international studies found an association between breast cancer and intake of fried meat and broiled meat in Finland and Uruguay. In 2000, researchers in Iowa identified the probable culprit, a heterocyclic amine abbreviated PhIP. Heterocyclic amines are a class of ubiquitous mutagens found in cooked meats, poultry, fish, and cigarette smoke. The effect was confirmed on Long Island and extended to grilled, barbecued, and smoked meats. But why more breast cancer risk? Well, these cooked meat carcinogens are mutagenic, meaning they damage DNA. In fact, you can directly correlate the number of DNA mutations in human breast tissue with estimates of dietary intake. They asked women undergoing breast reduction surgery about their meat cooking methods, and found that the intake of processed fried and stir-fried meat were correlated with the number of DNA mutations they found subsequently in their breast tissue. But we already knew these chemicals damage DNA. What surprised everyone was that not only may these meat chemicals trigger the original cancer-causing mutation, they may then promote the growth of the ensuing tumor, as PhIP was discovered to be a potent estrogen. They dripped the kinds of levels of PhIP you'd expect in your body after eating cooked meat, and found that it activated estrogen receptors almost as powerfully as straight estrogen. And that's what they found when they tried it on breast cancer cells. They found its proliferative potency on human breast cancer cells approaching that of pure estrogen. They concluded that PhIP possesses estrogenic activity at low concentrations, supporting the idea that exposure to PhIP, even at low doses, could result in estrogenic effects. We suggest that the well-established and unequivocal genetic toxicity of PhIP, coupled with its estrogenic activity, could drive clonal expansion and promote growth of the initiated initial cancer cell. These were breast cells in a petri dish, though. How do we know these carcinogens make it from cooked meat not only into the breast after you eat it, but into the breast ducts, where most breast cancers arise, so-called ductal carcinoma? We didn't know for sure until this study, which measured the levels of FIP in the breast milk formed in those ducts of non-smoking women. And the average concentration they found in the breast milk of meat-eating women corresponds to about right here on this graph. Significant breast cancer cell growth potential. One of the women was vegetarian, though, and of course none was detected in her breast milk. As we've seen, the cooked meat carcinogen FIP can cause DNA mutations that may initiate a tumor, may then promote the growth of the cancer due to its potent estrogenic activity, and the third strike is that FIP may then promote the invasiveness of breast cancer cells. The way breast tumors kill is by metastasis. It's got to invade surrounding tissues and organs. The way you test invasiveness is you put cancer cells into what's called an invasion chamber. Cancer cells go in the top on one side of a membrane with tiny pores, these little gray circles. This is the underside of the filter, showing no invasion. But add some estrogen, and you can see a few cancer cells peeking through. Add some FIP, and they really start going on the move. More breast cancer cell invasion promoting than straight estrogen. They conclude that in addition to its well-characterized genotoxic potential, DNA mutation-causing potential, FIP is potently estrogenic, is capable of powerful hormonal activity, and is able to potently stimulate breast cancer cells to invade through a membrane model. This finding, that FIP is able to exert this pro-invasive appearance in breast cancer cells at such low concentrations, is remarkable. The genetic toxicity of the compound, coupled to its ability to enhance cell proliferation and invasion, indicates that FIP can act not only to initiate the carcinogenic process, but also to promote it. The problem is, they say, that exposure to FIP is difficult to avoid, because of its presence in many commonly consumed cooked meats, particularly chicken, beef, and fish. But if you're able to somehow dodge cooked meats and don't suck on a cigarette, tailpipe, or incinerator smokestack, maybe it's not so difficult to avoid after all. The cooked meat carcinogens implicated in promoting the initiation, growth, and spread of breast cancer may also increase the risk of prostate cancer. The mechanism through which the consumption of well-done meat may increase prostate cancer risk is via the release of mutagenic compounds during cooking. The heterocyclic amines and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons are chemicals formed when the muscles of mammals, fish, or birds are cooked by high-temperature methods such as pan-frying or barbecuing. And in chicken, we just found out the temperature doesn't have to be that high. Just baking at about 350 for 15 minutes leads to significant production of heterocyclic amines, including FIP. So it's not just frying and grilling, barbecuing. These cooked meat carcinogens have also recently been associated with increased risk of kidney cancer, colon cancer, lung cancer, and pancreatic cancer, which is not a cancer we want to get. How do we decrease our exposure to these potent mutagens? Well, fried bacon and fish are the worst. Interestingly, chicken without skin had higher mutagen levels than with skin, which may act as an insulating layer for the meat. Now, medium rare is less mutagenic than well done, which may be why women in the Iowa Women's Health Study who consumed meat very well done appeared to have nearly 5 times higher risk for breast cancer than that of women who consumed meat rare or medium done. But this raises the so-called paradox of preparing meat, noted by the Harvard Health Letter. Well cooked and you risk cancer, undercooked and risk E. coli. Eating boiled meat, not broiled, but boiled in water, is probably the safest. If you eat meat that never goes above 212 degrees Fahrenheit, both your urine and feces are significantly less mutagenic compared to eating meat cooked at higher temperatures, meaning you have less DNA-damaging substances flowing through your bloodstream and coming in contact with your colon. More than 20 heterocyclic amines have been reported in cooked meats, fish, and poultry, prepared under common household cooking conditions. To reduce one's exposure to these cooked meat carcinogens, one could, of course, eat vegetarian, or even just refrain from eating meat for 24 hours, and the levels of the two chief heterocyclic amines drop to 0. So if you practice meatless Mondays, by Tuesday morning, the levels of PhIP and MEIQX, one of the most potent mutagens ever tested, becomes ND, non-detectable. Now, for a third cooked meat carcinogen, they actually did find some in a few folks, even though they hadn't eaten meat in 24 hours. That perplexed the researchers. Now, the 4 subjects that had quantifiable amounts of IQ45B in their urine after refraining from meat consumption, which is an isomer of a powerful animal carcinogen IQ, they had each eaten cheese and/or boiled eggs as part of their diet while abstaining from cooked meats. IQ and several other heterocyclic amines have been reported in fried eggs, so it's possible that IQ45B, which forms at temperatures well below 100 degrees Celsius, may be present in boiled eggs, or possibly other foods containing creatinine, such as cheese. That brought up an interesting side note, though. What about all the dietary supplementation of creatine by sports enthusiasts as a supplement, which turns into creatinine? They speculate that high consumption of creatine supplements could result in the formation of genotoxic heterocyclic amines in the body, a cautionary note for both vegetarians and meat eaters alike. Another finding of cooked meat carcinogens in a vegetarian was reported in a study comparing the levels of PhIP growing out in people's hair. It was detected in hair samples of all 6 of the meat eaters they tested, but was detected in 1 out of the 6 vegetarians. Now, it was low, just above the kind of level of detection, so they kind of dismissed it, suggesting that exposure occurs primarily through the consumption of cooked meats or poultry, and that non-meat-derived sources of exposure are probably negligible, but not if you smoke. Remember, these carcinogens are found in cooked meats, poultry, fish, and cigarette smoke. So even if you ate meatless Mondays all the way through meatless Sundays, you can still be exposed smoking cigarettes. Here's a measure of PhIP exposure in smoking meat eaters, non-smoking meat eaters, compared to smoking vegetarians and non-smoking vegetarians. So it's not enough to just eat healthy. More than 85% of breast cancers are sporadic and attributable to long-term exposure to environmental carcinogens, such as those in the diet, through a multi-step disease process progressing from non-cancerous to pre-malignant and malignant stages. Now, we know that the chemical carcinogen PhIP is one of the most abundant heterocyclic amines found in high-temperature cooked meats, and is recognized as a breast carcinogen. However, the PhIP's mechanism of action in breast cell carcinogenesis is not completely clear. How does it do it? Well, in this landmark new study, they demonstrated for the first time that cumulative exposures to PhIP at the kind of concentrations one would expect just eating meat effectively induced progressive carcinogenesis, cancer transformation of normal human breast cells from a non-cancerous stage to pre-malignant and malignant stages in a dose and exposure-dependent manner. From start to finish, they started out with normal human breast cells, and were able to transmute them completely into cancer cells, just using that cooked meat carcinogen found predominantly in fried bacon, fish, and chicken. That's all it took, and Jekyll becomes Hyde. Now, FIP was already established as a carcinogen. The reason they did this study was to develop a model of human breast cancer carcinogenesis from beginning to end, so they could test various interventions to see if they could somehow stop this process of cancer formation. For example, 3 recent meta-analyses reviewing all the epidemiological or population-based evidence concerning green tea consumption and breast cancer risk to date concluded that green tea consumption may be protective. OK, let's put the plant to the test. Here's how normal human breast cells rate against 6 different measures of cancer potential. Add some green tea to them, and nothing much happens. Add repeated exposure to the cooked meat carcinogen FIP, though, and all the cancer indicators go up. OK, here's the test. What happens if you now add the meat carcinogen with green tea phytonutrients? The transformation of breast cancer is blunted across the board, almost bringing cancer markers back to normal. Using a variety of measures, green tea phytonutrients were capable of suppressing FIP-induced cellular cancer and tumor progression. Remember this study, in which garlic won out as the #1 anti-cancer vegetable? Well, let's see what it can do. This is what's called a COMET assay, currently the standard technique for the evaluation of DNA damage. What you're looking at is the DNA of a single cell, a normal human breast cell, as visualized under a fluorescence microscope. It's in an electric field trying to pull the negative charged DNA to the right, but our DNA is normally supercoiled tightly together. But you add a carcinogen, like in this case the cooked meat chemical FIP, that literally breaks up our DNA, you can see the chopped pieces of DNA breaking away and flowing out in kind of like the tail of a comet, which is why they call it the comet tail test. The larger the tail, the more DNA has been broken off into pieces. But if you repeat the experiment, and this time, what if you add the same amount of carcinogen, but also add in some garlic phytonutrients at the same time? You get some damage, some DNA breakage, but not as much as before. Which kind of garlic would be expected to work the best, garlic or elephant garlic, the so-called garlic for people who don't like garlic? And the answer appears to be garlic. Garlic is best. What about flavonoid phytonutrients found in fruits, vegetables, nuts, and grains? Here are the top 100 sources in the world. Do they have a protective effect on the meat mutagen-induced DNA damage? They took white blood cells from healthy individuals and colon cancer patients and exposed them to increasing doses of 2 cooked meat carcinogens, IQ, found mostly in fried bacon and baked fish, and FIP, found mostly in fried bacon, fish, and chicken. They used the COMET assay again, measuring how much DNA was broken off in the tail, and as you can see, as the concentration of meat mutagens increases, so does the DNA damage. They then continued to pump in that meat mutagen at the highest level, but started adding some plant phytonutrients. Quercetin, found in foods like apples, red onions, and berries, and rutin, found in like citrus, buckwheat, and asparagus. Even as the highest carcinogen dose continues, adding plant phytonutrients starts to bring the damage down. That happened in both healthy individuals, the solid line, and cancer patients, the dashed line. But I want you to notice something else. Even at a 0 concentration of cooked meat chemicals, there was more DNA damage present in the white blood cells circulating in cancer patients. And they didn't have blood cancer, they had colon cancer. Even though the cancer was just in their colon, their whole body was affected by the disease state. Their whole body was under increased oxidative stress, inflicting significantly higher DNA damage. Or maybe the DNA damage came first, and is one of the reasons they have cancer in the first place. Either way, cancer patients experience less reduction of induced DNA damage, suggesting that higher concentrations of flavonoid would be required to achieve the same protective effect. So cancer and other chronic disease victims need even more fruits and vegetables to reduce the damage done by carcinogens. This study on cooked meat and the risk of breast cancer in Long Island women added to the accumulating evidence that consumption of meats cooked by methods that promote carcinogen formation may increase the risk of postmenopausal breast cancer. But it also offered a clue as to how we may be able to mediate that risk. A modest increased risk was found in older women eating the most grilled or barbecued and smoked meats over their lifetime, about 47% increased odds of breast cancer. But those same women who also had a low fruit and vegetable intake had a higher odds ratio, 1.74, 74% greater odds. Now, low fruit and vegetable consumption may just be a marker for unhealthy habits in general, but maybe there's something in fruits and vegetables that's protective. Check out this fascinating study. To review, the consumption of cooked meat appears to predispose individuals to cancer, whereas the consumption of cruciferous vegetables is thought to protect against cancer. If you remember, it's because cabbage family vegetables boost the activity of the detoxifying enzymes in our livers. For example, if you feed people broccoli and Brussels sprouts, they clear caffeine quicker, meaning if you eat a lot of these healthy vegetables, you have to drink more coffee to get the same buzz because your liver is so revved up. Same thing with cooked meat carcinogens. If you have a side of broccoli with your meat, you can significantly decrease carcinogen levels in your body. What they did is they started out with study subjects consuming cooked meat meals containing known amounts of these carcinogens. And this is the amount of the carcinogens they were absorbing into their bloodstream and then peeing out. In period 2, they ate the same amount of meat, but added broccoli and Brussels sprouts. Notice there's a significant drop in the amount of these meat mutagens circulating within their bodies, even though they ate the same amount of meat. Now, this wasn't a surprise. That's what cruciferous vegetables do, right? Boost our liver's ability to clear chemicals from our bodies. But this is what blew them away. In period 3, again, same amount of meat, but they took away the veggies, yet their liver function appeared to remain enhanced 2 weeks later. So there appears to be a prolonged beneficial effect of cruciferous vegetable consumption. So you can eat broccoli days or even weeks before the big barbecue and still retain a little protection. Though, of course, if you eat grilled veggie burgers instead, it would be even better at that barbecue, as apparently no matter how you cook plant-based foods, even if you deep fry them, no detectable heterocyclic amines are formed. The last time I talked about this study was in the context of the carcinogens in the smell of frying bacon. The ability of the fumes generated by frying meat to mutate DNA, potentially explaining both the increased risk of respiratory tract among cooks, as well as the lower proportion of deaths from respiratory diseases and lung cancer among vegetarians. This was borne out in a new study on the exposure of pregnant women to both the consumption of grilled meat as well as just exposure to the airborne fumes of grilling meat, even if they didn't eat it. Yes, the study found evidence that prenatal exposure to polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons from a diet including grilled meat might be hazardous for fetal development. For example, the effective ingested barbecued meat consumed in the last pregnancy trimester resulted in a birth weight deficit of 165 grams, a significantly smaller birth weight. But even if she didn't eat it, airborne exposure alone amounted to a birth weight deficit. Compared to no exposure, oral or airborne, just being around the barbecue was associated with a birth weight deficit, including a smaller head circumference in the newborn, nearly the same head shrinkage seen if she actually ate the meat. See, after being absorbed into the body, these cooked meat compounds are distributed to almost all internal organs and are transferred through the placenta to the fetus. and it appears that newborns and young children are especially vulnerable to the toxic effects in terms of birth outcomes. Most importantly, it was recently documented that prenatal exposure to airborne PAH may also have an effect on future cognitive development of children. We should never smoke around children. Maybe we should stop grilling around them as well. Even just living next door to a restaurant preparing meat may pose a hazard. They measured the incremental lifetime cancer risk, the excess cancer cases expected in backdoor neighbors of restaurants, given what's spewing out of the exhaust outlets attached to the fume hoods in the kitchen. They compared what was coming out of Chinese restaurants, American-style restaurants, and barbecue joints. Which do you think was worse? It was the Chinese. Why not the barbecue places? Well, they think it was because of the fish. They're broiling more fish in Chinese restaurants than in the barbecue joints. How bad is it? Well, they estimate that given the excess cancer risk, you wouldn't want to live right behind a Chinese restaurant more than a day or two a month, though maybe you could squeeze in an extra day behind one of the other restaurants. Their model suggests it may be riskier for adults, since they breathe more, eat more, and have more skin for the carcinogens to be absorbed through compared to children. Instead of trying to breathe less, though, it might be better to just move, or convince the restaurant to go vegetarian. 2 studies were recently published on plant-based diets and oral health. What do you think they found? Well, for periodontal disease, affecting the tissue surrounding the teeth, like gingivitis, gum disease, one of the leading causes of tooth loss, plant-based diets should be protective. After all, inflammation is now recognized as one of the key underlying causal factors in periodontal disease, and we know saturated fats produce an inflammatory response, and so no surprise this recent study found that high dietary saturated fat intake was significantly associated with a greater number of periodontal disease events. Saturated fat, which comes primarily in the American diet from basically dairy, donuts, and chicken. The same diet that leads to high cholesterol may also contribute to periodontitis, as bad cholesterol levels may be a risk factor for both. People with periodontal disease also suffered from arterial dysfunction. Wait a second, inflammation, high cholesterol, and arterial dysfunction? Is it any wonder there may be an association between chronic periodontitis and erectile dysfunction? By looking in your mouth, your dentist may learn more about you than you realize. We know we can reverse impotence with a plant-based diet. What about periodontal disease? A new study found that higher intake of high-fiber foods, especially fruits, may at least help slow periodontal disease progression. For oral cancer, it's a no-brainer. According to the latest review in the Journal of the American Dental Association, evidence supports a recommendation of a diet rich in fresh fruits and vegetables as part of a whole foods, plant-based diet. The foods found most protective against oral cancer include raw and green leafy vegetables, tomatoes, citrus, and carrots. Citrus fruits are acidic, though. Fine, less oral cancer, but what about the health of the teeth themselves? Might eating lots of sour fruit eat away at our enamel? Well, early case reports that raised red flags involved things like sucking on lemon wedges, not evidently a good thing for your teeth, or rampant cavities as a result of the bizarre habit of sucking bananas. Turns out you're not supposed to give your preschooler a banana to suck on day and night as a pacifier. Juicing 18 oranges a day for a decade or two may also take quite a toll. The conventional wisdom that fruit juice may be bad for your teeth, but not whole fruit, was challenged recently. The ability of fruits and their juices to erode enamel appears to be comparable, whether you're eating grapes or grape juice, carrots or carrot juice, oranges, apples, tomatoes, or raisins. Now, fruits and fruit juices weren't as bad as soda, Diet Coke takes the title for softening teeth the quickest, but it was a surprise that fruits and their juices had comparable effects, a result no doubt celebrated by the study's funders, the Sugar Bureau, as well as the Biscuit, Cake, Chocolate, and Confectionery Association. The spin the Dental Association put on it is interesting. If eating fruits and vegetables as whole foodstuffs may cause similar demineralization in enamel to when they're consumed as a juice, then hey, maybe fruit juice is not so bad at all. Of course, the glass half empty interpretation is that, wait a second, fruit is as bad as juice? Maybe fruit is worse than we thought for our enamel. And indeed, the latest research studying whether or not the consumption of fruit is cavity-causing found that the frequency of fruit consumption was associated with higher odds of cavities, though they acknowledged the role of fruit sugars in initiating dental cavities in humans has certainly long been a subject of debate. But is this going to be a problem for those eating like this as opposed to this? Among vegetarians, significantly more frequent consumption of sour products, predominantly raw vegetables and fruit and tomatoes, was observed. Though the level of oral hygiene was similar in both groups, those eating vegetarian did have more erosive lesions on their teeth, but did not find enough to be statistically significant, unlike the other study. No differences in plaque, gingivitis, cavities, or tooth loss, but they did find a greater incidence of demineralization and white spots in vegan subjects compared to omnivorous ones, which is a marker of greater acid erosion. So, what should people do? There are a number of foods and drinks that have the potential to cause dental erosion, both unhealthy foods like soda and sour candy, as well as healthy foods such as fresh fruit and some herbal teas. In the biggest study to date, consuming citrus fruits more than twice a day was associated with 37 times greater odds of dental erosion compared to those who consumed citrus fruits less often. It also appears risky to consume apple cider vinegar, or sports drinks once a week or more, or soft drinks daily. These habits resulted in the odds of erosion being 10, 4, and 4 times greater, respectively, than when the habit did not exist. So, should we avoid eating citrus? No. Even the study that found more cavities in kids eating more fruit concluded that even though the consumption of fruit might not be considered completely safe to eat in relation to cavities, we are not in a position to suggest that fruit consumption should be curtailed as a cavity preventive measure. At this stage, of greater importance is the preventive advice that children should brush their teeth twice daily with fluoride toothpaste. In fact, that study that looked at the erosive potential of fruit was done on folks without using fluoride toothpaste. Just don't brush right after you eat the fruit, though. You have to wait at least 30 minutes. See, people have this misconception that brushing immediately after consuming acidic food and beverages would prevent the damaging effects of dental erosion, when in fact the tooth surface, when softened by acids from food and beverage, is more vulnerable to damage by toothbrushing. They did this study where they had some folks swish some acidic solution, in this case Diet Sprite, and then brush immediately after, 10 minutes after, 20 minutes after, 30, or a full hour after. As you can see, if you drink soda without brushing at all, you may lose some of your teeth, but you can double or triple that damage if you then start brushing your teeth when they're in that acidified, softened state. They say we should wait at least 30 minutes, and probably a whole hour to be safe. Instead of brushing after eating anything sour, we should rinse our mouth with water to help neutralize the acids. Is there any evidence to support this? No, unfortunately, due to the limited number of clinical studies performed to investigate the association between diet and dental erosion. Prevention and treatment from a dietary perspective based really on common sense rather than evidence-based approaches. In fact, there's not a single study concerned with the dentist's advice for dietary change aimed at preventing tooth erosion, but rinsing with water after eating or drinking anything acidic is the best advice we have so far. Those that tend to profit from coconut oil claim it has miraculous powers curing everything from cancer to jock itch. Perhaps the boldest claim may be as a potential cure for Alzheimer's based on a series of anecdotes and one study. Study of the ketogenic agent AC1202. You can certainly make money selling 20-pound buckets of coconut oil, but even more selling some kind of patented supplement, which is what this is, a concentrated form of the medium-chain fatty acids in coconut oil purported to be the active ingredient. At first, it looked like it was working, but by the end of the study, any effect it had disappeared. Though there was one genetic subgroup where it appeared to be working better, but when that group was properly randomized, even that effect disappeared. So the only such study ever done on concentrated coconut oil components found little effect, and no studies have ever been done whatsoever on Alzheimer's and coconut oil itself. As the Alzheimer's Association put it, there's no scientific evidence that coconut oil helps with Alzheimer's, and hey, the coconut oil promise has been around for more than 3 years. If the administration of coconut oil was indeed beneficial, it would presumably be shouted from every mountaintop, and not just the mountains that sell coconut oil. And that's all we know so far. Why don't we know more? There have been over 1,000 articles published on coconut oil in the medical literature. The problem is they're studies like this. Did you know coconut oil enhances tomato carotenoid tissue accumulation compared to safflower oil in the Mongolian gerbil? It includes nuggets like this. The testes of the coconut oil-fed animals weighed significantly less than those of the safflower oil-fed animals. Who says coconut oil isn't effective? How else are you going to shrink the testicles of Mongolian gerbils? Even if the science isn't there, why at least not try treating Alzheimer's with coconut oil? Well, unlike other natural remedies like the spice saffron, which was able to beat out placebo and seemed to work as well as the leading drug without the side effects, coconut oil is one of the rare plant sources of saturated fat, normally only found in animals, which tends to increase LDL, or bad cholesterol, the #1 risk factor for a #1 killer, heart disease. So, hey, you want to try coconut oil on someone with Alzheimer's for a few days to see if it makes a difference? Fine, God, I'd try almost anything. But if, as expected, you don't see any improvement, I'd be hesitant to keep anyone on it long term. Now, those selling coconut oil say one needn't worry, because coconut oil contains a saturated fat that doesn't raise cholesterol. You hear the same thing from the beef people. The National Cattlemen's Beef Association is always going on about how beef contains a saturated fat called stearic acid, unlike those evil saturated fats palmitic, myristic, and lauric acids, which do increase blood cholesterol levels. Stearic acid has been shown to have a neutral effect on blood cholesterol. Now see, that's true, and beef does contain stearic acid, but guess what? It has twice as much of the palmitic and myristic, which they just admit it does raise cholesterol. It's like Coca-Cola saying they know for a fact that soda doesn't make you gain weight because Coke contains water, and water has a neutral effect on weight gain. Yeah, but that's not the only thing in it. And the same thing with beef, and the same thing with coconut oil. Years ago, I profiled this study that found that cholesterol levels were significantly lower during a coconut oil diet, but only when compared to a butter diet. You know you got a problem when the only way you can make your product look good is to compare it to diets rich in butter. Yes, it made bad cholesterol go up, but not as bad as butter, but how much is that really saying? Now, that was all the science we had for 10 years, but 4 new studies have recently come out, a population study and 3 clinical studies. The population was of Filipino women, and although those that ate the most coconut oil had worse levels of bad cholesterol, those that ate the most coconut oil were also more overweight, which alone can raise your cholesterol. When the fact that the coconut oil eaters were eating more calories, were more overweight, when that was kind of factored out, the rise in cholesterol lost statistical significance. To really control for factors, though, you've got to put it to the test. The first clinical trial involved giving people 2 tablespoons of coconut oil a day for 3 months, and their bad cholesterol went up a bit, but not significantly. During this time, though, they were all forced to lose weight by being placed on a calorie-restricted diet. When you lose weight, your LDL should drop naturally. The fact that it didn't on the coconut oil suggests an adverse effect. The most encouraging study was this one, an open-label, meaning not blinded, no control group pilot study, in which 2 tablespoons of coconut oil a day for a month added to their regular diet did not worsen their cholesterol, though when tested in a better-designed study, a randomized crossover trial, coconut oil did significantly worsen bad cholesterol. Hence Walt Willett's recommendation from Harvard, if you're going to use it sparingly. Now look, if you're eating so healthy that your LDL cholesterol is under 60 or 70, then it may not be a problem. Unlike saturated animal fats, coconut oil doesn't cause that spike in inflammation immediately after consumption of animal foods, which makes sense because, as you'll remember, it may be the dead bacterial endotoxins in animal products ferried into the body by saturated fat that are to blame. In this study, for example, they compared the effects of chocolate cake made out of coconut oil, flaxseed oil, or cod liver oil on the effects on inflammatory markers. Not much change in the inflammatory gene expression for the coconut or flax cakes, but cod liver oil cake may indeed be worse. Years ago, it was shown that vitamin D isn't just the sunshine vitamin for us, but for mushrooms as well. You take some shiitakes, for example, put them under a sun lamp for an hour, and they make vitamin D just like we do lounging at the pool. Now, most mushrooms you buy at the store don't have any vitamin D because they're grown in the dark, but there are now sun-bathed varieties on the market that boost significant levels, even now available in sprinkle form. Some mushrooms grown outside in the wild may have some as well, but only about 12% of one's recommended daily allowance per cup. Is the vitamin D in mushrooms bioavailable, though? Well, in 2008, there was a case report of a dark-skinned individual living in England in the winter, who, like the other 9 out of 10 South Asians living in the UK, was vitamin D deficient. His physician prescribed a vitamin D supplement. However, after doing his own research, the patient decided to self-treat. He bought a UV bulb from a local hardware store, and proceeded to shine this directly onto 2 cups of regular mushrooms a day before stir-frying and consuming them. He repeated this on a daily basis for 3 months, and indeed his vitamin D levels shot up and he was cured. So it's reasonable to assume that such mushrooms may be able to provide a source of vitamin D for those at risk for deficiency. This was only one person, though, so further studies are necessary, and finally, those studies have been done. Bioavailability of vitamin D from ultraviolet light-irradiated button mushrooms in healthy adults deficient in vitamin D, a randomized controlled trial. They compared the mushrooms to vitamin D supplements, to placebo, and both the mushrooms and the supplements were equally effective in raising D levels compared to placebo. The type of vitamin D made by mushrooms, though, is vitamin D2, which is typically derived from yeast, and is the form traditionally prescribed by doctors to cure vitamin D deficiency. Most supplements, though, are D3, which is the type found in plants and animals, and typically derived from sheep's wool. Back in 2008, it was established that vitamin D2 was effective as D3 in maintaining one's vitamin D levels at standard daily doses. Whether folks were given D2, D3, or a combination of half D2, half D3, it didn't seem to matter much in terms of improving vitamin D levels in their bloodstreams. But that was 5 years ago. What's the update? Is vitamin D2 better than vitamin D3? It apparently depends on how much you take and what your starting levels are. Taken daily in doses up to 4,000 units a day, there appears to be no significant difference in the ability of D2 or D3 to raise vitamin D levels. But if you take megadoses on a weekly or monthly basis in doses up to 50,000 units at a time, D3 works better than D2. And if you're not vitamin D deficient, if your vitamin D levels are normal, for example, you live in California, get enough sun, then D2 from mushrooms or supplements doesn't appear to raise your levels further, But if your levels are fine, why take supplements in the first place? The only reason we care about the levels in our blood is because of the benefits we expect to get from those levels, such as a longer lifespan. The latest Cochrane review on vitamin D and mortality found that while D3 supplementation may be able to reduce mortality, other forms of D, including D2, did not. This may be because most of the D2 trials used megadosing regimens up to 300,000 units injected into people. But until we have good data suggesting D2 supplementation can actually extend one's life, D3, the type of vitamin D found in animals and plants, may be preferable to vitamin D2, the vitamin derived from fungi. The best animal to get D3 from is yourself. But if you live at a latitude where you're not able to make enough, then there are both animal and non-animal sources of vitamin D3 supplements. To my surprise, studies of the effects of pets on human health and well-being have evidently produced a mishmash of conflicting results. Some studies show pets lower your blood pressure, in fact, in some cases more than even drugs do. But other studies found no effect, or even that pet owners have higher blood pressure. Does having a pet increase your survival after a heart attack, or decrease your survival after a heart attack? One area where there's a bit more consistency is children's health. The presence of furry pets in the home appears to cut the odds of acute respiratory illness in half, and may even decrease the risk of getting the common cold. But which pets work better? Cats, like my Charlotte, Emily, and Ralph, or dogs, like my Lily? Published recently in the official journal of the American Academy of Pediatrics, respiratory tract illnesses during the first year of life, effect of dog and cat contacts. The first study that has evaluated the significance of pet contacts during childhood for the development of respiratory tract symptoms and infections, including ear infections. They found dog and cat contacts during early infancy may be associated with less illness in general, and may have a protective effect on respiratory tract symptoms and infections. But as to which is better, in comparisons between cat and dog contacts showed a more significant protective role on respiratory infectious disease. Children having a dog at home were significantly healthier, had less frequent ear infections, and tended to need fewer courses of antibiotics during the study period than children without dog contacts. Cat ownership seemed to also have an overall protective effect, although weaker than dog ownership, on the infectious health of infants. Though when it comes to protecting children from tummy aches, both cats and dogs appeared equally effective in reducing the risks of gastroenteritis. Gargling is one of the best things to do to treat a sore throat. As one of my medical mentors, Dr. Michael Clapper, instructs you, take a glass of warm water, add a pinch of salt, hold the glass of salt water in your hand, open your mouth, take a deep breath, tilt your head back, slide a generous mouthful to the back of your throat, and, with your mouth still open, gently breathe out through the water. Continue until the end of the breath, and then spit it out in the sink. Repeat until the full glass of salt water is used. Works wonders to soothe a sore throat when you have a cold, but I never heard of gargling to prevent a cold. Though not popular in the Western world, gargling has been strongly recommended in Japan to prevent upper respiratory tract infections, such as the common cold. However, there have been no controlled trials, and it remained unresolved as to whether gargling was really effective, until this one was published in 2005. They found a significant drop in the incidence of the common cold, but not the flu, suggesting that simple, plain water gargling is effective in preventing upper respiratory tract infections among healthy people. This virtually cost-free modality would appreciably benefit people both physically and economically around the world. What do they mean economically? Well, most Americans, for example, report about 2 to 3 colds a year. That actually surprised me. Between medical costs and work absenteeism, we're talking nearly $40 billion a year, the common cold. So even if you take into account the 71 seconds it took, on average, to walk to and from the sink and gargle, and multiply that by the average wage to calculate the cost of gargling in wasted time, it's still considered a cost-effective strategy. Here's the latest, a new study on whether it works in kids, gargling for oral hygiene and the development of fever in childhood. A total of nearly 20,000 preschoolers were observed for 20 days, and just like the study for adults, gargling appears to lower the odds of illness by about a third, and gargling with green tea may work better. Note they speculate that the fact that tap water is chlorinated may have played a role, so gargling with filtered water may be less effective, but I would stay away from iodine solutions such as betadine, since one can run into the same kind of iodine overload thyroid dysfunction you can get by eating too much kelp. The latest review on diet and the risk of inflammatory bowel disease, such as ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease, suggests that of all dietary factors, animal protein from meat and fish was found most associated with a higher risk of inflammatory bowel disease. They think it might be the blood components in meat that degrade into carbon monoxide, or some of the carcinogens created by cooking muscle or added to processed meats intentionally. And then, of course, there's the arachidonic acid, the pro-inflammatory omega-6s, and meat contains huge amounts of certain bacteria that have been linked to inflammation. The antibiotics in meat may even be mucking with people's intestinal flora. Who knows? Either way, a diet high in animal protein may be associated with not only increased risk of getting inflammatory bowel disease in the first place, but relapsing back if you already have it, consistent with the data I presented last year that even just a semi-vegetarian diet was highly effective in preventing relapses in Crohn's disease, for example. But one potential risk factor that I had never heard of was micro or nanoparticles. Foodstuffs in developed countries contain increasing quantities of microparticles, such as titanium dioxide, used by the millions of tons as a whitening, brightening pigment, mostly to make white-colored paint, but also as a food additive to make white-colored food. So much so that people eating conventional diets may be ingesting 1 trillion particles of titanium dioxide every day. Who cares, though? Well, a few years ago, researchers found evidence of micro and nanoparticles in all 18 out of 18 samples of diseased colons they looked at, either colon cancer or inflammatory bowel, but none in the 3 healthy colons they looked at from folks who died in a car accident or from a heart attack. Now look, that's a tiny sample, but it got people thinking, and more importantly, putting it to the test. They took intestinal biopsies from people and added some titanium dioxide to see if it would cause inflammation. Here's the level of secretion of an inflammatory cytokine at baseline, and then here's after you add the titanium dioxide they use in food. Nothing. No inflammation. Maybe they got some dead tissue or something, so they tried adding a little or a lot of bacterial endotoxin. All right, that worked. That got an inflammatory response. Before declaring the food additive safe, though, they tried one last thing. What if you combine these together, the titanium dioxide and a little bit of endotoxin mixed together? Presumably, you'd still be down here somewhere, but instead got this. So their thinking was that while titanium dioxide itself is inert, non-toxic, in the gut it may act as transporters of inflammatory substances like endotoxins from the inside of our gut into the gut wall, kind of a Trojan horse mechanism. What happens in a Petri dish, though, may not happen in a person. How are you going to test the theory in people, though? You can't go around trying to give people inflammation. So they took people actively suffering from Crohn's, took microparticles out of their diet, and saw if they got better. 18 patients with active Crohn's, 9 stayed on their regular diet, and 9 were placed on a low microparticle diet. And within a month, those on the low microparticle diet had a significant decrease in disease severity. And by the end, 7 out of the 9 were in remission, whereas none were in remission in the regular diet group. Now, in addition to removing things they expected to contain titanium dioxide, coffee whitener, white cheese, powdered sugar, they also removed processed meats and fish, fearing that they had microparticles in them too. But that complicates things, right? Because just cutting down on meat alone is considered one of the most powerful Crohn's interventions. So maybe that's why they got better. Maybe avoiding titanium dioxide had nothing to do with it. And indeed, a larger trial in which both groups were told to cut down on processed meat and seafood, they both improved the same, regardless of their microparticle intake, which is consistent with this study that did not find that Crohn's patients were eating significantly more white processed foods like crispy shell, chewing gums, marshmallows, powdered donuts, etc. So where does that leave us? Well, maybe high concentrations of dietary microparticles should not be completely ruled out as a potential contributor to intestinal inflammation, but there's just not much evidence suggesting it's harmful. If you look at the most concentrated sources, though, out of nearly 100 products tested, none of them are particularly health-promoting. So if you want another excuse to avoid Hostess donuts, well then, there you go. Early onset of puberty is considered a risk factor for a number of diseases in adulthood, including hormone-related cancers, a shorter lifespan, metabolic syndrome, and cardiovascular disease. The conventional thinking has been that the reason the age of puberty has been getting earlier and earlier is because our children have been getting fatter and fatter. Well, our kids have been getting heavier, especially in the United States. We're number one. But while the age of a girl's first period has been dropping in the US and Asia, in Europe, despite their kids getting heavier too, there hasn't been a steady decline in puberty onset. So maybe it's less about how much kids are eating and more about what they're eating. The most consistent link between diet and premature puberty has been animal protein consumption. For example, every gram of daily animal protein intake, that's the weight of a paperclip, has been associated with about a 17% increase in the risk of girls starting their periods earlier than age 12. Why this link between animal protein and premature puberty? Well, we know meat increases the levels of the growth hormone IGF-1, and that alone is associated with early-onset puberty. But maybe animal protein is just a proxy for the endocrine-disrupting chemicals that build up the food chain in animal products. Recent reports have found significant associations between exposure to environmental pollutants and sexual maturation. This was done over in Europe. In the US, a similar relationship was found with the flame retardant chemicals, for example, which are found mostly in poultry and fish, unless you're eating cat food. Over the last 3 decades, human exposure to these levels of industrial pollutants in the U.S. have increased from virtually non-existent to almost everyone carrying them around now. They appear to have multiple adverse effects, but of all the potential toxicities, endocrine disruption, meaning hormonal disruption, may be the main concern in children. Girls with the most circulating in their bloodstream appeared up to 10 times more likely to start their periods early. But since these chemicals are found mostly in fish and poultry, maybe the levels of these chemicals in their bloodstream is just kind of a proxy for their meat consumption. Whatever the reason, animal protein intake is associated with early-onset puberty, whereas plant protein has the opposite effect. Children with higher levels of vegetable protein starting puberty 7 months later than average, and children eating more animal protein may start puberty 7 months earlier than average. Soy seems most protective. Girls with the highest levels of dietary isoflavone intake, the phytonutrients in soy foods, may experience their onset of breast development approximately 7 or 8 months later than girls with the lowest levels of intake. What effect might these shifts have on disease rates? Well, delays in the onset of in the timing of puberty in response to beneficial dietary habits, higher intakes of vegetable protein and soy, and lower intakes of animal protein, may be of substantial public health relevance. A later age of starting one's period is related to a reduced risk of breast cancer, and a later first period is associated with lower total mortality, meaning a longer lifespan. Hence, a delay in the timing of puberty by approximately 7 or 8 months, which is achievable with dietary modifications, either more plants or fewer animals, may translate into about a 6% reduction in breast cancer risk, and up to a 3% decrease in total mortality. And it's not just a problem in girls. Boys eating more meat in childhood appear to be more likely to grow up with the kind of abdominal fat deposits that increase risk for heart disease. An evidence-based systematic review of acai berries was recently published by the National Standards Research Collaboration, an impartial scientific body that refuses to take support from product manufacturers, cited by the World Health Organization as one of the most authoritative sources on such matters. What did they find? Whenever a new purported superfood hits the market, the first thing researchers tend to do is look at its chemistry, such as antioxidant capacity, which was done back in 2006. Based on one measure, it had the highest antioxidant capacity of any food reported to date, a remarkable finding I reported at the time, arguing that despite its cost, frozen acai pulp represented one of the best antioxidant bangs for one's buck. But still, we didn't know what it did outside of a test tube. The next step is to go from test tube to petri dish and try it out on some human cells. They dripped the concentration of acai berry phytonutrients one would expect in one's bloodstream after eating them on some blood cancer cells taken from a woman with leukemia, and saw a dramatic rise in cancer cell mortality. In fact, about twice what was found previously using similar concentrations of hibiscus tea on the same cancer. Acai was also found to boost immune cell function at extremely low doses. Here are some videos of white blood cells gobbling up invading yeast. Nom 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 nom. Come back here. Isn't that amazing? They're like sucking them up like Slurpees. I could watch these all day. Anyway, sprinkle some acai berry powder on them, and they gobble more. With no acai for breakfast, white blood cells were able to engulf about 140 yeast, but in the presence of a tiny amount of berry powder, they engulfed closer to 200. Slowly but surely, researchers began piecing together the mechanism by which acai affected cellular function. Still no human studies, though. Researchers moved from cells to animal models. Who could forget the addition of acai to cigarettes has a protective effect against emphysema in mice. Instead of adding berries to their cigarettes, though, it might be easier to just encourage the mice to quit smoking. But then finally, starting in 2011, studies on actual people. Pain reduction and improvement in range of motion after daily consumption of an acai in about a dozen folks with painful conditions like osteoarthritis. After 3 months, antioxidant levels went up, and pain levels went down. Though, since there was no blinded control group drinking like some artificially acai-flavored Kool-Aid, the placebo effect could not be excluded. And finally, one last pilot study, the effects of acai on metabolic parameters. 10 overweight folks were given 2 packs of frozen acai pulp every day for a month, and even though they were allowed to take it with sugar, their fasting blood sugars dropped, as did their insulin levels and cholesterol, and it significantly blunted the sugar spike caused by a standardized meal, all without any observed adverse effects. In fact, the only theoretical concern cited in the new review may be that it might work too well. If you're on diabetic blood sugar-lowering medications, it could potentially drop your blood sugar too low, or if you have an autoimmune disease or on immunosuppressants, it could stimulate your immune system too much. But what about the case report of the guy whose muscles started dissolving after using this acai berry supplement? Turns out there was no acai berry in it at all. That's the problem with taking supplements. They are so poorly regulated, you never know what you're getting. For example, a study was done on 27 supplements of another purported superfruit, pomegranate. Here's the main ingredients. OK. Except of the 27 supplements tested, only 5 appeared to be actually what they said. Fine, you say, no pills, you'll just stick to the juice. 45 commercial pomegranate juice samples from 23 different manufacturers in the United States. They all said they contained 100% pomegranate juice on the label, but most of them lied. Only 6 out of 23 were what they said they were. The only source you can be guaranteed to get authentic pomegranate juice has no label at all. Four things that we can do that may reduce our risk of developing Parkinson's disease is exercise, and avoiding dairy products, pesticides, and avoid getting hit in the head, which means wearing your seatbelt, bike helmet, and, if you read journal articles written by scientists with way too much time on their hands, avoid getting attacked by extraterrestrials, a leading cause of traumatic brain injury in comic books. What about avoiding pesticides and other industrial pollutants? A recent autopsy study found higher levels in the brains of Parkinson's victims of PCBs found in Monsanto's Aerochlor, which was banned in 1979 but still pollutes the world. And the more PCBs found in the brain, the worse the brain damage. The worst 3 PCBs appeared to be numbers 138, 153, and 180, the levels of all of which are significantly lower in the bodies of those eating plant-based diets. So, does a vegan diet reduce risk of Parkinson's disease? Good question. When we know that every single prospective study on dairy products or milk and Parkinson's disease tended to find increased risk, and it may be that dairy products in the United States are contaminated with neurotoxic chemicals. There's substantial evidence suggesting that exposure to pesticides may increase Parkinson's disease risk, and autopsy found higher levels of pollutants and pesticides in the brains of Parkinson's disease patients, and some of these toxins are present at low levels in dairy products. They're talking about toxins like tetrahydroisoquinoline, a Parkinsonism-related compound found predominantly in cheese. Although the amounts of this neurotoxin, even in cheese, are not really high, the concern is that the chemical may accumulate in the brain over long periods of consumption. Caffeine consumption, both in Asian and Western populations, appears to protect against the development of Parkinson's disease, but what if you already have it? A new study found that giving folks the equivalent of about 2 cups of coffee a day worth of caffeine significantly improves symptoms of the disease. Of course, there's only so much you can charge for coffee, so drug companies took caffeine and added a side group so they could patent it into new drugs, which appear to work no better than plain caffeine, which is dramatically cheaper and probably safer. Similarly, other plant foods, such as berries, may be protective, and plant-based diets in general may help prevent Parkinson's. Animal fat and dairy may increase risk, whereas a plant-based dietary pattern may protect against Parkinson's disease. We don't know if it's the animal fat per se, though. It could be the animal protein that's increasing risk. Maybe it's the dairy, mercury in fish, the blood-based heme iron, or less of the protective antioxidants in plant foods and plant-based diets. We didn't know until recently. There have been successful case reports like this one, in which a dietitian was struck down with Parkinson's, and she was able to clear most of her symptoms with a plant-based diet rich in strawberries, whole wheat, and brown rice, rich sources of these 2 phytonutrients. But there hasn't been a formal interventional trial published until now. At its root, Parkinson's is a dopamine deficiency disease because of a die-off of dopamine-generating cells in the brain. These cells make dopamine from L-DOPA, derived from certain amino acids in our diet. But just like we saw with the serotonin story, the consumption of animal protein may block the transport of L-DOPA into the brain, crowding it out. So at first, researchers tried what's called a protein redistribution diet. Let's basically only let people eat meat for supper, so that patients are hopefully sleeping by the time the negative effects kick in. But researchers didn't consider cutting out animal products altogether until it was discovered that fiber consumption naturally boosts L-DOPA levels. So hey, a plant-based diet, particularly in its vegan variant, is expected to raise levodopa bioavailability and bring some advantages in the management of Parkinson's disease through two mechanisms: a reduced protein intake and an increased fiber intake. That's why plant protein works best, because that's where fiber is found. So they put people on a strictly vegan diet, keeping beans towards the end of the day, and indeed found a significant improvement in symptoms. In my comparison of the antioxidant content of 282 beverages last year, hibiscus tea came out #1, so my family switched from drinking matcha green tea to the hibiscus fruit punch recipe I shared in that video. We have since switched from using tea bags to just bulk dried hibiscus flowers, which we soak and then just blenderize into the tea so we don't throw anything away. But just because something has antioxidant power in a test tube doesn't mean it has antioxidant flower power in the body. Maybe the phytonutrients aren't even absorbed. They were found to be bioavailable in rodents, but I haven't had a pet hamster since I was a kid. So we didn't know about humans until now. Consumption of a hibiscus aqueous extract, in other words tea, and its impact on systemic antioxidant potential in healthy human subjects. If you take people and have them just drink water, basically, for 10 hours, this is what happens to the antioxidant level in their bloodstream. Your antioxidants get slowly used up throughout the day, fighting off all those free radicals, unless you replenish your antioxidant stores. Now, it's hard to get people to fast for 10 hours, so in addition to water, they gave the study subjects something they knew wouldn't mess up their antioxidant measurements: white bread and cheese. So this is what happens when you eat water, white bread, and Gouda all day. What if instead, at the beginning of the experiment, you give people a single cup of hibiscus tea? Within an hour, see a nice spike in the antioxidant level in your bloodstream, but then the effect disappears, unless you sip hibiscus throughout the day, or eat something other than Wonder Bread cheese sandwiches. As I noted last year, the Harvard Nurses' Health Study found that the daily consumption of the amount of cholesterol found in just a single egg appeared to cut a woman's life short as much as smoking 25,000 cigarettes, 5 cigarettes a day for 15 years. Following up on that research, a study in the journal Atherosclerosis found that just 3 eggs or more a week was associated with a significant increase in artery-clogging plaque buildup in people's carotid arteries going to their brain, a strong predictor of stroke, heart attack, and death. In fact, they found a similar exponential increase in arterial plaque buildup for smokers and egg eaters. Those that ate the most eggs had as much as 2/3 the risk of those that smoked the most, the equivalent of a pack-a-day habit for 40 years or more. This did not go over easy with the egg industry, as revealed in a series of internal memos about this group of researchers. Retrieved through the Freedom of Information Act, the American Egg Board discussed the wisdom of making industry responses when the public knows there's a vested interest. So the executive director of the Egg Board's Egg Nutrition Center proposed they contact some of our friends in the scientific community to have an objective, external source author the response. If you do so, he wrote to one of their friends at Yale, we'll certainly compensate you. But the prominent Yale physician refused to participate in an overly antagonistic letter, given his friendship with one of the co-authors of the review. If you can't find someone with credentials to counter the science, why not just make one up? How's this for a bizarre twist? An email was circulated to discredit the researchers by a Dr. MD, PhD, why not throw in an MBA while you're at it, who claimed the prestigious researchers didn't know a thing about nutrition. Only when the principal investigator of the egg study replied to the allegations did we learn that the Dr. doesn't exist. His email was hacked. The poor guy was like, I was on vacation, I don't know what you're talking about. And apparently the culprit was never found. Daily dried apples versus daily dried plums, impact on cardiovascular disease risk factors in postmenopausal women. First thing I thought was the study funded by the U.S. Apple Association or the International Prune Association? I could bet what the results would be, but turns out neither. Just our taxpayer dollars hard at work. Great. So what'd they find? 160 older women randomly assigned to a dried apple group or a dried plum group, and followed for a year, a dozen dried apple rings a day, or about 8 prunes. And within 3 months, a significant drop in cholesterol in the apple, but not prune group, which stayed down through the rest of the study. In terms of inflammation, both dried fruit regimens lowered C-reactive protein levels about the same, though perhaps prunes may have caused a quicker decrease in inflammation, whereas dried apples may result in a greater decrease overall. 12 apple rings is equivalent to eating about 2 apples a day. They think that the cholesterol-lowering properties of apples may be due to its unique pectin fiber composition, which may increase fecal excretion of bile, though the apple phytonutrients themselves, even without the fiber, appear to lower cholesterol on their own. What about dried figs? The California Fig Board did not want to be left out, sponsors of both Fig Fest and Fig Feast, as well as this recent study. 14 figs a day. That's a lot of figs for 5 weeks, and nothing. Daily consumption of figs did not reduce bad cholesterol. And finally, what about dates? 4 or 5 dates a day for a month. And again, nothing. Though if anything, they did tend to bring down triglyceride levels a bit, which is surprising given the sugar content in dates. A recent study on the glycemic index of dates found them surprisingly low. The open circles are what straight sugar water does to your blood sugar, and here's that same amount of sugar, but in date form. Dates beat out other common fruits in terms of containing more vitamins and more minerals, in fact touted as the richest source of dietary minerals, but because they're dried, they have about 5 times more calories than fresh fruits, ounce per ounce. And so in terms of nutrient density, they're really quite comparable to these other fruit, though apples clearly have them beat when it comes to lowering cholesterol. Though there is an International Prune Association keeping us all apprised of the latest prune news from around the world, in the U.S., the California Prune Board successfully pressured the FDA to change the name from prunes to dried plums, which evidently evokes more of a positive fresh fruit goodness image, in hopes of attracting their target audience, women. Of course, it might help if they actually included 1 or 2 on their board. The name change is in hopes of de-emphasizing its connections to digestive regularity issues, but hey, why sell yourself short? Check this out. Randomized clinical trial, prunes versus Metamucil, also known as psyllium. Constipation is a common problem, affects up to 1/5 of the world's population. Nearly 60 million Americans suffer from chronic constipation, particularly a problem in women, the elderly, a pathological condition that is often severe enough to disrupt daily activities, a deranged quality of life, and responds poorly to available medical remedies, and may prompt sophisticated, potentially harmful surgical procedures. Despite all this, it's still frequently considered a trivial issue, and affected individuals tend to self-medicate, either using over-the-counter laxatives or quote-unquote natural remedies, but none of these have been adequately investigated until now. Fiber supplements can be inconvenient, taste nasty, cause bloating, even choking, so we need a food-based, natural, convenient, tasty alternative. But do prunes actually work? Here's the study subjects at baseline. Each dot is a complete spontaneous bowel movement. Note how many people had 0 bowel movements per week at baseline, about an average of 1.7 a week, which went up to 3.5 on prunes, a bowel movement every other day or so, then back to baseline off of the prunes, then on Metamucil got up to 2.8, then back down. And remember the Bristol stool scale? Significantly better stool consistency on the prunes as well. The researchers conclude that treatment with dried plums resulted in a greater improvement in constipation symptoms than the commonly used fiber supplements. So, given their palatability, tolerability, availability, dried plums should be considered as a kind of first-line therapy for chronic constipation. If this is what adding one plant can do, 3.5 bowel movements a week, what if all you ate was plants? Where do vegans rate? Going, gone. Not 2, not 3, but 10.9 a week. Dried fruits are calorically dense. Should we be concerned that eating dried fruit may make us fat? Remember that fig study I covered that added 14 figs to people's daily diets? Surprisingly, that did not lead to significant weight gain. Wait a second, that's 300 calories of figs a day. Over 5 weeks, that's 10,000 calories. Did they disappear into thin air? No, figs are just so packed with fiber and satiating that even without trying, people just ended up eating less of other foods throughout the day. I get full just thinking about eating 14 figs a day. Was this just a fluke, though? Let's look at those other new studies. What about adding 3/4 of a cup of dried apples to your diet every day for a year? 200 extra calories a day, but no significant change in weight. 200 extra calories of prunes a day for a year? No significant change in weight. And the same thing with a month of a daily 300-calorie load of dates. In general, the 5 to 10% of Americans that average a tablespoon or more of dried fruit a day tend to be less overweight, less obese, have a slimmer waist, and less abdominal obesity. They tended to eat more, but yet weighed less. Similar findings were found for those that eat nuts or nut butters, lower body mass index, and a slimmer waist. In past videos, I've explored the potential mechanisms. Nuts are filling, may boost metabolism, and may end up flushing some of their fat down the toilet. What if you put them both together? What would be the effect of adding daily fruit and nut bars on top of one's regular diet for 2 months? It took about 100 folks who were overweight, randomized into 2 groups. Half ate their regular diet, and the other half ate their regular diet plus 2 fruit and nut bars a day, totaling an extra 340 calories. But these weren't candy calories. These were largely whole plant food calories, dried fruits and nuts. 2 daily fruit and nut bars for 2 months did not cause weight gain, and they had extra sugar in them. Maybe that's why cholesterol didn't get better despite the nuts, which should have helped. Recipes with less sugar might be expected to improve lipid profiles. So that's brands like this, or even cheaper, just eat some trail mix. After about an hour of strenuous exercise, long-distance athletes can really start to deplete their glycogen stores, the body's source of quick energy. Studies dating back to the 30s found that by hooking athletes on a treadmill up to an IV drip of sugar water, you could delay fatigue, and that drinking sugar water could help as well. So the sports supplement industry has come up with an array of energy drinks, shots, gels, bars, chews, even sports jelly beans, used, what a coincidence, by the Jelly Belly cycling team. In fact, the Jelly Belly Candy Company paid for a study that found that sports jelly beans could shave 4 or 5 seconds off of a 10K cycling trial compared to sports drinks or gels. But what about compared to raisins? Given that professional, collegiate, and recreational sporting events are supplement-centered, heavily marketed to, athletes at all levels may be left with the impression that specially designed supplements are essential for optimal performance. Yet these products are often expensive, and cheaper natural foods that may provide a healthier alternative are often overlooked. There are low-cost, natural food products rich in carbs, such as sun-dried raisins, that have the potential to improve performance to a similar degree. Raisins are nutritious, convenient, typically palatable, and are a cost-effective source of concentrated carbohydrates. But do they work as well? They work exactly as well, exact same time. Same thing comparing raisins to a commercial sports gel. Same respiratory exchange, same carbon-fat oxidation, same energy expenditure. In fact, the only significant difference between raisins and jelly beans was in quote-unquote hedonic scores, pleasantness scoring, and raisins beat out the jelly beans. Compared to jelly beans with flavors like extreme watermelon, there was a greater preference for just raisin-flavored raisins. When researchers at the Emerging Pathogens Institute recently ranked foodborne pathogens to figure out which was the worst, number 1 on their list was Salmonella, ranked the food poisoning bacteria with the greatest public health burden in our country, the leading cause of food poisoning-related hospitalization, and the number 1 cause of food poisoning-related death. Where do you get it from? Well, I've talked about the threat of eggs. According to the FDA, 142,000 Americans are sickened every year by egg contaminated with Salmonella. That's an egg-borne epidemic every year. But Salmonella in eggs was only ranked the number 10 worst pathogen-food combination. Salmonella in poultry ranks even worse, the number 4 worst infected food in the United States in terms of both cost and quality-adjusted years of life lost. In terms of the burden of human salmonella poisoning attributable to various U.S. foods, eating chicken may be 8 times riskier than eating eggs. Due to strengthening of food safety regulations under the Clinton administration, the number of Americans food poisoned by chicken every year dropped, from about 390,000 a year to 200,000, and rightly hailed as a significant accomplishment. So now eating chicken only sickens about 200,000 people in the U.S. every year. But isn't that a bit like some toy company boasting that they've reduced the amount of lead in their toys, and so are now poisoning 40% fewer kids? Not exactly something to boast about. And the numbers have since rebounded back upwards. In the late 90s, human salmonella cases have increased by 44% since then. The rebound in incidence of salmonella infection in the United States is likely a result of several factors, but one important risk factor singled out is eating chicken, as the proportion of chicken carrying salmonella infection has increased. When people think manure and meat, they typically think ground beef, but when you look at E. coli levels in meat, which is considered an indicator of fecal contamination, sure, there's fecal matter in about 2/3 of American beef, but that number is greater than 80% fecal contamination in poultry, chicken and turkey. Why have we seen a decrease in the Jack-in-the-Box E. coli 0157, but not chicken-borne salmonella? In the last decade or so, the infection of beef and subsequent children have dropped, like 30%. But not only has salmonella not declined in the past 15 years, it's actually increased lately. One reason is that there was a prohibition of contamination with the deadly E. coli in beef. What a concept! So selling contaminated beef is illegal. Why is beef laced with E. coli contaminated fecal matter considered adulterated, but chicken laced with salmonella contaminated fecal matter A-OK? It certainly kills more people than the banned E. coli. It all goes back to a famous case in 1974, when the American Public Health Association sued the USDA, saying, wait a second, you can't put a stamp of approval for wholesomeness on meat contaminated with salmonella. What could the USDA possibly say in meat's defense? As relayed by the circuit judge, the USDA pointed out that there have been salmonella outbreaks linked to dairy and eggs, for example, too. So, since there are numerous sources of contamination which might contribute to the overall problem, it would be unjustified to single out the meat industry and ask that the department require it to identify its raw products as being hazardous to health. That's like the tuna industry arguing, there's no need to label cans of tuna about mercury levels, because you could also get exposed to eating thermometers. The D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals upheld the meat industry position, though, arguing that you can allow potentially deadly salmonella in meat because, and I quote, "American housewives are normally not ignorant or stupid, and their methods of preparing and cooking of food do not ordinarily result in salmonella food poisoning." What? That's like saying, minivans don't need seat belts in the back seat because soccer moms don't ordinarily crash into things. Now, 39 years later, 200,000 Americans sickened every year by salmonella that continues to be legally allowed in chicken. Why is there such a huge disparity in prostate cancer rates? The incidence of clinically malignant prostate cancer is highest in African Americans, some 30-fold greater than in Japanese men, and 120 times greater than seen in Chinese men in Shanghai. Well, in general, the Western diet is one in which animal protein and fat consumption is high, whereas the fiber intake is low. In contrast, the proportion of the total caloric intake from animal fat in the more vegetarian-style Oriental diet is low, and the fiber content is higher, so maybe diet is playing a role in some of these diseases. But these healthier diets are not just low in animal proteins and fat and high in starch and fiber, they're also rich in weak plant estrogen. This study, for example, found higher levels of phytoestrogens in the prostate fluids of men in countries with relatively low rates of prostate cancer. In vitro studies have shown lignans can slow the growth of prostate cancer cells in a petri dish, so a pilot study was launched on flaxseed supplementation in men with prostate cancer before surgery. Why flax seeds? Because while these anti-cancer lignans are found throughout the plant kingdom, flax seeds have up to 800 times more than any other food. So they took a bunch of men with prostate cancer about a month before they were scheduled for surgery to get their prostates removed, and started them on a relatively low-fat diet with 3 tablespoons of ground flaxseed to see what effect it might have on the growth of their tumors. And though they were skeptical that they would observe any difference in tumor biology in the diet-treated patients with such a short-term dietary intervention, just within those few weeks they found significantly lower cancer proliferation rates and significantly higher rates of cancer cell death. Now, this was compared to so-called historical controls, meaning compared to the kind of cancer growth one typically sees in their situation, not to an actual randomized control group. But a few years later, a study was finally published in which men could act as their own controls. These were men that just got their prostates biopsied and were scheduled to get a repeat biopsy in 6 months' time. So they did the same thing. After the first biopsy, they reduced the fat in their diet and put them on ground flax seeds to see if it made their repeat biopsy look any different. These were men with what's called PIN, which is like the prostate equivalent of ductal carcinoma in situ in the breast, an early stage of cancer. That's why they were getting repeat biopsies, to make sure it wasn't spreading. And this is what they found. Significant drop in PSA levels, which is a biomarker of prostate cell growth, a drop in cholesterol, which is what we'd expect with a lower fat diet and all that extra fiber, and importantly, a significant decrease in the cellular proliferation rate. In fact, in 2 of the men, their PSA levels dropped so much they didn't even have to go through with the second biopsy at all. There hasn't been much research on this kind of precancerous prostatic hyperplasia, with only 4 epidemiological studies reported at the time. They yielded varying findings, with increased risk associated with higher energy protein and animal product intake, and decreased risk related to consumption of alcohol, fruit, and green and yellow vegetables. In some, a low-fat, plant-based diet high in phytoestrogens. Preliminary but impressive results. A flaxseed-supplemented lower-fat diet appeared to decrease cellular proliferation rates in men with precancerous changes in their prostates. However, given the composite nature of the intervention, both a lower-fat diet and flax seeds, it's unknown whether the effects can be attributed to the flaxseed supplementation, a fat-restricted diet, or both factors working together. Now, to figure that out, you'd have to design some study where you split men into 4 groups, or a control group, a flaxseed-only group, a lower-fat-only group, and then a flaxseed and lower-fat group. And so that's exactly what they did. 161 prostate cancer patients, at least 21 days before their prostate removal surgery, were randomly assigned to one of those 4 arms, and, as the title describes, it was apparently the flax seeds, but not dietary fat restriction alone, that reduced prostate cancer proliferation rates in men pre-surgery. Here are the numbers. Whether they were eating their usual or lower-fat diet, it was the men eating the flax that saw their tumor proliferation rates significantly drop. Though if you look at what they actually ate, the quote-unquote low-fat diet groups never really got down to the target 20% calories from fat. I mean, they did drop their fat intake, but you'd hardly call 25 to 28% calories from fat a low-fat diet. Still, the lower-fat groups were the only ones who saw a significant drop in cholesterol and body weight, so there are certainly benefits. Bottom line, further studies are needed before we can definitively support flaxseed supplementation as a proven complementary therapy for prostate cancer. To date, however, the evidence suggests that flaxseed is a good, low-cost source of nutrition and is well accepted and safe to use, so why not give it a try? Drug companies are hoping to capitalize on the fact that the consumption of certain plants appears to lower the risk of diabetes by isolating the active components for use and sale as pharmacological agents. Though not as profitable, why not just eat the plants? One plant in particular that's now been tested is flax. We've known for 20 years that having ground flax seeds in your stomach can blunt the blood sugar spike from a meal, but it's never been tested in diabetics until now. An open-label study on the effect of flaxseed powder supplementation in the management of diabetes. A tablespoon of ground flax seeds every day for a month, and, compared to the control group, a significant drop in fasting blood sugars, triglycerides, and cholesterol, as well as the most important thing, a drop in A1C level. This was just after a month. Though if one's sugars are already well controlled, though there may be no additional benefit. No weight gain was reported in people adding a quarter cup of ground flax a day to their diets for 3 months. In fact, the flax group ended up with a slimmer waist than the flaxseed oil or control group, even up to nearly a half cup a day, more than I'd recommend. Still no significant weight gain, though this was only after a month. How does flax help control diabetes? Well, flaxseed consumption may improve insulin sensitivity in people with glucose intolerance. After 12 weeks of flax, there was a small but significant drop in insulin resistance, perhaps related to the drop in oxidant stress, given the antioxidant qualities of flaxseed phytonutrients. Now, this was a small, unblinded study. It's hard to come up with a convincing fake flaxseed placebo. So look, if this was some drug they were testing, I'd never prescribe it based on this one study, but it isn't a drug, it's just flax seeds. There's just good side effects. So even if this study was a fluke or fraud, flax seeds have other benefits. So even in the worst-case scenario, I'd still end up benefiting my patients, not quite ready or able to reverse their diabetes completely, with a completely plant-based diet. About half of the American population says they have sensitive skin, defined loosely as tingling, chafing, burning, itching sensations when exposed to various environmental factors. A similar high prevalence has been reported throughout Japan and Europe, especially in women. Often, there are no obvious signs, and so it's often kind of dismissed by the medical community as a princess and the pea phenomenon, a mindset that has hindered the investigation of this problem. But now it's largely recognized as a genuine phenomenon of physiological origin. thought to arise from an alteration of the skin barrier, allowing potentially irritating substances to penetrate the skin and generate an inflammatory reaction. OK, so what can we do about it? Well, recently, supplementation of flaxseed oil was found to diminish skin sensitivity and improve skin barrier function and condition. In a randomized, double-blind, 12-week study, women were given about a half teaspoon of flaxseed oil a day internally versus safflower oil as a control. That's the amount of oil found in about a teaspoon and a half of flax seeds. After 3 months, there was a significant decrease in skin reddening in the flax group compared to the safflower group when an irritant chemical was painted on their forearms to measure skin sensitivity. Their skin also ended up significantly better hydrated, had significantly better barrier function, as evidenced by lower transepidermal water loss, skin that's less rough, less scaly, and smoother. You can actually see the changes in a close-up view of the skin. The skin looked pretty much just as dry and scaly before and after the safflower oil intervention, but significantly improved after the flaxseed oil. Sensitive skin is typically treated by topical application of lotion and creams, but why not treat it from the inside? This study showed that daily supplementation with flaxseed oil improved skin appearance and led to a decreased skin sensitivity by improving epidermal barrier function and decreasing inflammation. The best source of flaxseed oil is within the flaxseed itself. Then you get all the nutrition of the whole food, and it's cheaper and more stable. Unlike the oil, you can bake with the seeds without destroying the omega-3s, and even store ground flaxseed for a month at room temperature without spoilage or oxidation. A recent editorial in the Journal of the American Association for Cancer Research starts out, "There are far too many breast cancer survivors," by which she means it's great that women with breast cancer are living longer, but lamenting the fact that the number of women getting breast cancer in the first place isn't going down. 1 million women every year. As with any other epidemic, identification and aggressive reduction of any reversible risk factors must become an immediate priority. One such risk factor appears to be inadequate fiber consumption. For example, this new study out of Yale, among premenopausal women, higher intake of soluble fiber was associated with a significantly reduced risk of breast cancer, 62% lower odds. And when they just looked at younger women with the hardest to treat breast cancer, the estrogen receptor-negative tumors, then those eating the most fiber appeared to have 85% lower odds of breast cancer. This is what's called a case control study, where you compare women who already have a disease to those who don't, and you ask both to tell you, what they used to eat. That's how they were able to associate breast cancer with inadequate fiber intake. The breast cancer patients were significantly less likely to report eating lots of plant foods, the only natural place fiber is found. The reason it's important to understand how they arrived at their conclusion is that maybe it's not the fiber at all that what's so protective. The reduced risk of breast cancer associated with dietary fiber intake observed in this study may in fact indirectly reflect the effects from some other dietary nutrients, and thus dietary fiber here may simply act as a marker for other exposures which have been linked to reduced risk of human cancer as well, such as folate, phytochemicals, carotenoids, vitamin C and E, which are also like dietary fiber found in plant foods, such as vegetables, fruits, and pulses, legumes, beans, peas, lentils, soy, as well as in grains. And look, if you're eating more plants, you may be eating fewer animals. An increased consumption of fiber from foods of plant origin, such as vegetables, fruits, and grains, may reflect a reduced consumption of foods of animal origin. A combined analysis of a dozen such studies published in the Journal of the National Cancer Institute show they all found pretty much the same thing, a consistent, statistically significant association between breast cancer risk and saturated fat intake, which is mostly cheese, cake, and chicken in this country, and a consistent protective effect for a number of markers of fruit and vegetable intake was demonstrated, such as vitamin C, which, like fiber, is basically only found in plant foods. every 20 grams of fiber a day was associated with a 15% drop in breast cancer risk. Now, case control studies are susceptible to something called recall bias, though, since they rely on people's memory. If people with cancer are more likely to selectively remember all the bad things they ate, since they may be feeling responsible for their condition, it could artificially inflate the correlation. So prospective cohort studies might provide stronger evidence. That's where you take a bunch of healthy women and follow them and their diets over time to see who gets breast cancer and who doesn't. By 2011, 10 such studies had been done, and the same thing was found. In fact, every 10 grams a day increment in dietary fiber intake was associated with a significant 7% reduction in breast cancer risk. Pretty much the same thing the other studies found, right? Remember, 15% for every 20 grams? This has important public health implications. That was 2011. By 2012, we were up to 16 prospective or forward-looking studies on dietary fiber and breast cancer, and they found the same thing. For the first time, though, they showed a potentially nonlinear response, meaning the more fiber you eat, the more benefit you appear to get. American women average about 15 grams of fiber a day, only half the minimum daily recommendation. Maybe that's why vegetarian women may have lower breast cancer rates. More plant foods equals more fiber. Vegetarians only seem to be averaging about 20 grams a day, though. Better, but still not even making the minimum. So one might really have to venture out into vegan territory. Off the chart averaging 47 grams a day, or if a really healthy vegan diet, 59 grams of fiber a day, or eating lots and lots of vegan Thai food, 68.7. A quarter century ago, a theory was put forth as to why those eating plant-based diets have lower cancer rates. Vegetarians appeared to have up to 3 times the level of lignans circulating within their bodies, thanks to the grains and other plant foods they were eating, these anti-cancer compounds. See, back in 1980, a new compound was described in human urine, a compound X, originally thought to be a new human hormone, but later identified to be from a large group of fiber-associated compounds widely distributed in edible plants, known as lignans. Population studies suggest that high intake reduces breast cancer risk, but where is it found? Seeds, whole grains, vegetables, fruits, berries. With that kind of list of healthy foods, why isn't this just like the fiber story, where lignan intake is maybe just a surrogate marker for healthy plant food intake? Well, in a petri dish, lignans do directly suppress the proliferation of breast cancer cells, but only after the plant lignans are converted into human lignans by the good bacteria in our gut. That's why we want to use antibiotics judiciously, because a few days on antibiotics dramatically drops your body's ability to make these anti-cancer compounds from the plants we eat, and it can take weeks for our good bacteria to recover. That's why women with urinary tract infections may be at higher risk for breast cancer, because every time they took a course of antibiotics, they may be stymieing their good bacteria's ability to take full advantage of all the plants they were eating. Though this remains a little more than a hypothesis or educated guess at this point. This is the National Cancer Institute study that provided the strongest evidence to date that there may indeed be something special about the lignan class of phytonutrients for breast cancer prevention. They took a bunch of young women at high risk for breast cancer, meaning they had a suspicious breast biopsy showing either precancerous changes or carcinoma in situ, or already had breast cancer in the other breast, and gave them a teaspoon of ground flax seeds every day for a year, before getting repeat needle biopsies to see if there were any changes. Yes, there are lignans in sesame seeds, nuts, whole grains, legumes, certain fruits and veggies, but they're most concentrated in flax seeds. They could have instead asked women to eat 10 cups of strawberries a day for a year, but they'd probably get better compliance with just their teaspoon of ground flax seeds. So, what happened by the end of the year? The primary endpoint was the expression of a proliferation biomarker associated with cancer called Ki-67. In 9 of the 45 women, it went up, those in red, but in the other 80% of the women, it went down. And overall, they found less cellular proliferation in their breast tissue and fewer precancerous changes. For those who don't like the taste of flax seeds, sesame seeds may work just as well. Even though flax seeds have significantly more lignans than sesame, you appear to produce about the same amount of lignans from them, though this was comparing them whole, and when you feed people whole flax seeds, some may not get chewed up and may pass right through you. So, ground flaxseed may be the best source overall. The class of phytonutrients known as lignans can be thought of as the kind of Western equivalent of the isoflavone phytoestrogens found in soy foods popular in traditional Asian diets, as they share many of the same purported anti-cancer properties. Since, as we've explored, soy food consumption is associated with both preventing breast cancer and prolonging breast cancer survival, one might expect the same to be found for lignans. Well, we just covered the prevention angle, with population-based evidence, in vitro evidence, and clinical evidence supporting lignans in preventing breast cancer. But what about for women already diagnosed with the dreaded disease? 3 studies followed a total of thousands of women diagnosed with breast cancer, were recently published to answer that question. The first was from New York, reporting substantially reduced risks of overall mortality, and especially breast cancer mortality, associated with higher lignan intakes in postmenopausal women. Although higher lignan intakes may just be a marker of a diet high in plant foods, specific combinations of foods particularly high in lignans may be necessary to produce effects on mortality-related risk factors to subsequently impact breast cancer survival. Then there was one out of Italy in 2012, at surgery, when the women were getting their primary breast tumors removed. They had some blood drawn, and within 5 years, those that had lower circulating levels of lignans, here in blue, were significantly more likely to die from their cancer coming back than those with more lignans in their bloodstreams, in red. They concluded lignans may play an important role in reducing all-cause and cancer-specific mortality of patients operated on for breast cancer. And same thing out of Germany, the largest study done to date, postmenopausal patients with breast cancer who have high serum lignan levels may have better survival. Here's the survival curve. The higher the better. Those who had the most lignans in their bodies tended to live the longest, and tended to live the longest disease-free. So, what should oncologists tell their patients? Well, given this objective evidence that blood levels of lignans, a biomarker of lignan intake, improves breast cancer outcomes, should we declare success and recommend that our patients with breast cancer supplement their diet with flaxseed? Well, not based on laboratory and population evidence alone, the editorial concluded. Robust clinical evidence is needed. The population data looks so promising that researchers decided to put lignans to the test by feeding women flax seeds, the most concentrated source of lignans, to see what would happen. The incidence of breast cancer is increasing in the Western world, and there's an urgent need for such studies. One of the ways the chemotherapy drug tamoxifen works is by boosting the levels of angiogenesis inhibitors like endostatin, which is a protein the body makes to try to starve tumors of their blood supply. Using a technique called microdialysis, where you can stick a catheter into a woman's breast and kind of suck out some of the fluid bathing the breast cells, if you give women tamoxifen for 6 weeks, the levels of endostatin within the breast tend to go up, which is a good thing because it helps stop tumors from hooking up a blood supply. And the same thing happens when you instead add a little under a quarter cup of ground flax seeds to their daily diet. The flaxseed doesn't seem as powerful as the chemo, but further study was definitely warranted, and here it is. A randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled clinical trial of flax seeds in breast cancer patients. Between the time of first biopsy and surgery, patients were randomized to either the treatment or the placebo group, either a flaxseed-containing muffin or a control placebo muffin. Why flax seeds? Again, they're the richest source of lignans, with levels up to 800 times higher than that of 6 other plant foods tested in the vegetarian diet. They went all out. The muffins were wrapped up, labeled with numerical code, and the coded muffin packages were then dispensed. So what happened? Well, muffin compliance was good, a sentence you don't often read. Remember, they got a biopsy of the tumor before the study started, and then a little over a month later went in for surgery to get the tumor removed. So they had tumor samples before and after 5 weeks of flax or no flax. Those lucky enough to be randomized into the flax group saw, on average, their tumor cell proliferation go down, cancer cell death go up, and their CERB2 score go down, which is a marker of cancer aggressiveness and potential for forming metastases and spreading. They concluded, dietary flaxseed has the potential to reduce tumor growth in patients with breast cancer, and this was just in 5 weeks. If the therapeutic index seen in the short-term study can be sustained over a long-term period, flaxseed, which is inexpensive and readily available, may be a potential dietary alternative or adjunct to currently used breast cancer drugs. George McGovern, who died last year, aged 90, was best known for his 1972 presidential defeat to Richard Nixon. But he also chaired a committee that released the first dietary guidelines in the United States in January 1977. The simple fact is, quoting from the press conference, that our diets have changed radically within the last 50 years with great and often very harmful effects on our health. These dietary changes represent as great a threat to public health as smoking. The diet of the American people has become increasingly rich in meat and other sources of saturated fat and cholesterol, and in sugar. Most all the health problems underlying the leading causes of death in the United States could be modified by improvements in diet. Ischemic heart disease, cancer, diabetes, hypertension are diseases that kill us. They're epidemic in our population. We cannot afford to temporize. The public wants some guidance, wants to know the truth, and hopefully today we can lay the cornerstone for the building of better health for all Americans through better nutrition. As Dr. Hegstead later recounted in an interview, a founding member of Harvard's nutrition department that spoke at the press conference, the meat, milk, and egg producers were very upset, and they weren't the only ones. The president and chair of the International Sugar Research Foundation called the report unfortunate and ill-advised, all part of the emotional anti-table sugar tidal wave conspiracy, evidently. From the official record of the committee hearings, simply stated, people like sweet things, and apparently the McGovern Committee believes that people should be deprived of what they like. There is a puritanical streak in certain Americans that leads them to become do-gooders. The president of the Salt Institute felt that there's definitely no need for a dietary goal that calls for the reduction of salt consumption. In fact, the assertion from the report that improved nutrition may cut our nation's health bill by 1/3 was challenged. See, what the committee didn't understand is that healthcare expenditures increase if the lifespan is prolonged. See, if people live longer because they eat healthier, it could be more expensive. As some researcher pointed out, if tobacco were banned, the increase in the expected lifespan would simultaneously increase the cost of care of old people, which comes under the category of healthcare expenditures. If people eat healthier, the Salt Institute warned, we might have more old people to take care of. The National Dairy Council likewise recommended the dietary goals be withdrawn and reformulated to have the endorsement of the food industry. You know, as soon as Haagen-Dazs says they're OK, then go for it. The two industries that went most ballistic, though, were the meat and egg producers, who demanded additional hearings were held. Egg councils requested the distribution of the dietary goals be immediately stopped. The frightening development, as far as the egg industry was concerned, is that the advocates of a modified low-cholesterol diet now have the credibility and prestige of the U.S. Senate. The president of the American National Cattlemen's Association described why the meat industry reacted rather violently, complaining that meat is never mentioned in a positive way in the guidelines. The only mention of meat are those associating meat consumption with various degenerative diseases. If these dietary goals are moved forward and promoted in the present form, entire sectors of the food industry— meat, dairy, egg, sugar, and others— may be so severely damaged that when it is realized that the dietary goals are ill-advised, as surely they will be, production recovery may be out of reach. Thus, guided by my conscience as the president of the National Livestock and Meat Board, I am certain that actions of the animal industries to ensure Americans are properly fed with abundant meat and other animal foods is an honorable and morally correct diet course. The meat industry recommended the committee withdraw the dietary guidelines and issue a corrected report. They especially didn't like guideline number 2, to decrease meat consumption to lower saturated fat intake. Senator Dole, Kansas Senator Dole, offered to have that amended from decrease meat consumption to instead increase consumption of lean meat. Would that taste better to you? He asked the president of the Cattlemen's Association, who replied, "Decrease is a bad word, Senator." So what happened? By the end of the year, a revised version of the dietary goals was released. Indeed, the guidelines was changed from decrease meat consumption to choose meat, poultry, and fish, which will reduce saturated fat intake. That wasn't enough for the meat industry, though. They wanted the whole Committee on Nutrition eliminated completely and its functions turned over to the Agriculture Committee. The New York Times, noting that the Agriculture Committee looks after the producers of food, not the consumer, editorialized that folding the Nutrition Committee into the Agriculture Committee would be like sending the chickens off to live with the foxes. And that's what happened. The Senate Committee on Nutrition and Human Needs got disbanded and placed within the Senate Committee on Agriculture. George McGovern fought until the bitter end, though, when an interviewer confronted him with the serenity prayers, "Grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change," McGovern rejected the notion, saying, "I keep trying to change them."